Now, my message on carbon pricing. We believe within the business sector that carbon pricing is a key tool to make sure that we take into account climate change in our business decision. And we expect to see progressively carbon pricing becoming a tool used in a lot of different geographies. And when you say carbon pricing, there are several methodologies to achieve this. We probably have a preference for market-based cap-and-trade approaches, but carbon prices, whichever way, is indeed a very good tool. And what would be important for us is to see in the Paris Agreement the recognition of the importance of carbon prices, although we know that decisions will be taken by national governments, by the way, in some cases, regional governments. But what's also important in the Paris Agreement is to see the reference to the mechanism which could help this carbon pricing converging into a system giving a global price signal for carbon. We know that it will take time, but for global companies, it's very important that we see this convergence. We have today a situation in which we have a carbon pricing mechanism in Europe. China has committed to carbon pricing. 2017, a global market in China. We are seeing initiatives at the infranational level. California, some Canadian provinces, by the way, they are thinking of linking their own systems. We are seeing countries, Mexico, Chile, who are also moving into some kind of carbon pricing mechanism. We think that this should become a much largely used feature or tools, and again, creating the mechanism which would help us see a convergence between this carbon pricing is something which would be for us a must in the Paris Agreement. And I know it's not yet done. I mean, I had the opportunity to discuss with Minister Fabius Friday night, and he told us that there was still a significant discussion on this, and that it was not certain that this would be that there would be a reference to carbon pricing in the agreement. It's still in the draft between brackets as we speak. Again, it would be a big disappointment for the business community if Paris was not the COP at which carbon pricing is signaled as being a very important tool. With that, I will leave you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to have one more presentation, then we're going to have a panel conversation. So please join me in welcoming the CEO of Energis, Stéphane Wakanin. Stéphane?
Not on.
Start the podium. Start. Yeah. Wait.
Now can you hear me? Yes. I'm going to try to talk about a model that is working in the introduction of innovations into large-scale clean energy projects. And hopefully things continue to work well here. Okay. It's a very simple formula that we came up with at Energis. We're an investment company based in Canada. We invest globally. And the formula is, as such, global impact can only come from large scale. And large scale can only come from returns, which means a lot of people have to make a lot of money in order for an industry to truly, truly scale. So do you remember when a telephone looked like this? Now, some people might say that it took, 100 or so years to build a telephone infrastructure. But really, if you think about it, how long did it take to get to a world that we live in today where there are so many different ways to communicate through social networking and other forms of access technologies? Maybe 10, 15 years. It happened in an instant. And so why can't it happen in energy? Why do we keep saying that it takes time, longer and longer, when in reality we're at about 6%, depending on who you speak to, of clean renewable energy in the world, and 94% of, dirty energy. So we're moving to that red line of 2 degrees and dangerously close to surpassing it unless we do something different. So what I'm advocating is a model that kind of breaks the status quo, because I'm simply saying here in Paris that the status quo isn't working. So if we look at the scale, we're clearly not at scale. So let's look at returns. Generally, the people that finance innovations tend to be venture capital type investors. But venture capitalists are running away from the clean tech sector. So while we talk about emissions targets and governments are doing their part, private sector investors are actually fleeing. So in this case, it was being called an increasingly large disaster area. In the case of CalPERS, I know there's a representative here from CalPERS, but it was called a noble way to lose money. In the case of Vantage Point, somebody talked to me about Vantage Point. It's a California VC. They were blaming their LPs, their investors, saying you can't invest in that sector anymore because you're losing too much of our money. And so, clearly, we're not having returns. And if we're not having returns, we're not having scale or global impact on the problem. So why is this happening? Very simply, and I'm really sort of hyper-simplifying it for a short time frame, it's happening because the tech companies that exist in the world today, who have ways of bringing down the cost of clean energy substantially, we don't have to invent them, they exist, they are hitting a wall when it comes to commercialization. The reason that they're hitting a wall when it comes to commercialization, lack of revenues, is because the financiers of large-scale projects are risk-averse, and that's okay. They're pension funds. They have to protect the pension money. Or they're banks, and they have, very strict guidelines by which to lend money. And so we have to find a different way to introduce innovations into large-scale projects. Very simple concept, and we're proving it in the market today. It's a hybrid investment strategy. At Energis, and we're advocating that everybody should copy this model. We invest in the tech companies who have the great efficiencies to bring down the CapEx and OpEx of clean tech, of clean energy projects, but then we invest in the projects. So we're in 2 asset classes, and this is where we get unique. We're investing in projects to be the bridge of commercialization and not just hope and pray like a venture capital fund that their companies get sales. We actually make sure they get sales because we're writing the ticket. We're the ones making sure that those purchases are happening. And we're making qualified risk assessments because we're on the boards of those companies. We know when the products are ready for mainstream. So here are examples of where we're doing it. Goliath Wind is an example of an Estonian tech company who has a design for a 3.3 megawatt turbine. Now, there aren't disruptive players in the big wind market. And yet here's a company who can make a wind turbine with a completely different design, cost half the price of what the big vendors sell a large turbine for. Their innovations are in the modularity of the solution. Their innovations are in the magnet implementations. Their innovations are fundamentally in the fact that you can manufacture this wind turbine, 100% of it, locally wherever you build a wind farm. And so at Energis, we said, what an amazing thing. When local requirements are so important in large wind projects, like we have in Quebec, for example, where the large vendors complain about the local content requirements. And yet here's one that can be manufactured easily locally. The first prototype was built in a roller coaster factory in Budapest. So if a roller coaster factory can make a complex turbine, anybody can. So we said, let's first build wind projects, and then let's invest in the company. We're building wind projects in India, we're building wind projects in Turkey. Now that we have the commercialization piece taken care of, we're invested in the tech company. Both sides win. Let's look at tidal. GE said that tidal is going to rival wind and solar. I'm excited about that because when GE says things, everybody listens. GE Alstom. I see a friend from Alstom in the audience. And so Shuttle Hydro has an incredible design that brings down the cost of CapEx and OpEx on tidal. This is a 2.5 megawatt, but it is completely modular and it scales bigger and smaller. It's good for tides. It's also good for rivers. It's a platform, it's a hub, it's a turbine, it's an incredibly modular solution. So we said, what a great investment, let's make sure there's a project. And we're the lead investor in the largest tidal project of its kind in the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia, Canada. And so we're benefiting from an interesting feed-in tariff, but fundamentally we don't need government subsidies. This is private sector driven, and in fact the entire financing of the project was private sector, led by Energis, with a small bank loan, and then at the end we're able to construct this amazing solution and replicate it into different markets. There's so many different places in the world where we can do tidal. Let's look at solar. Everybody knows that solar costs have come down. Let's look at the ecosystem around solar. And so we looked at what stands behind the panel. And we invested in a company called Solantro, which is a microprocessor that does for a solar panel what an Intel Pentium chip does for a computer and what a Qualcomm chip does for a cell phone. That is to say that it makes the solar more efficient, more powerful. And then we looked at a great company, also a Canadian company in this case, called GPL, Green Power Labs, which has smart grid. So we looked at what happens after the solar is deployed and how to use smart grid software and specifically predictive analytics and predictive controls to make a solar implementation 30% more efficient. So if you have a semiconductor behind the solar panel and smart grid on the other side, your solar is that much more profitable. Yeah. And so let's look at models to deploy that. One great one, and the CEO, Francis Tourini, is here in the front row. He's a bald guy. I only invest in bald guys. Just kidding. And so this company is doing something remarkable in all markets where there is off-grid. This is off-grid solar. In Africa, there are 600 million people that are off-grid. And so this is a simple model where you take something that looks like a portable toilet and you put solar panels. The new version is actually 3 times bigger. And inside of it, you've got batteries. In the current version, there's 150 batteries in each one of them. And people line up, as we did our first deployments in Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire. People line up and they do mobile payments with their cell phones. And they're able to take home not only the battery, so they can charge cell phones, there's USB ports, but also accessories. So they have a way to bring home lighting, LED lights, and other things to the home. This is a very scalable model where we're doing it also in Philippines and also looking to do it in India and other places where there's off-grid, which, by the way, creating synergies in the portfolio and really, really maximizing technology, we're using the Solantro chip inside of this iCabin. So we're helping to drive revenues by being invested in this company. At the end of the day, if we implement this model at scale, we are going to speed up the deployment of clean energy, and we're going to get from 6% to 20% and where we need to really be to avert disaster faster. And we need to do it faster because the status quo isn't enough. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we're good. So we're going to invite up to the stage a couple more people if we're going to have a conversation. To my immediate left is Jonathan Taylor, Vice President of the European Investment Bank. And in the middle is David Hertel, who's the Minister of Sustainable Development, Environment, and Climate Change for the province of Quebec. And we're going to talk now about the role of gender diversity in clean technology. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. Here we are. So let's start with you, David. I mean, I think we've heard about the importance of carbon pricing. We've heard about some models for investing. We'll get back to some of that later. But I think what's going on in Quebec right now is really, really interesting in terms of the leadership, the amount of money that you've amassed and what you're going to do with that, the commitments that you've made. Give us a little, the elevator pitch, if you will, about sort of where you are in terms of the cap and trade and the partnerships and all this money.
Right. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for having us. We've set up the largest cap and trade system in North America, linked it successfully to California in 2014. Ontario has taken the decision to join the cap and trade system next year. 2 days ago, Manitoba took the same decision. But already you have two subnational governments from two different countries with two different languages being able to successfully link a cap and trade system. And this system in Quebec covers 85% of all emissions. And we've already raised $1 billion in revenues from the cap and trade system on our way to our 2020 target of $3 billion. Now, two things that are very interesting about the system is that, first of all, it's directly linked to very ambitious emissions reduction targets. Our 2020 target is 20% compared to 1990 levels. And we announced last week our 2030 target, which is 37.5% reductions, again, compared to 1990 levels. And we're also, Quebec is also a signatory of the Under 2 MOU, which commits us to an 80 to 95% reduction target by 2050. So the 37.5% reduction target, which is the most ambitious in Canada, is actually directly linked to the carbon market, the cap and trade system working. So we have an effective way of reducing emissions, and like I said, most emitters, almost all the major emitters, are covered by the market. But also these revenues are entirely invested in Quebec's Green Fund. And by law, this fund must invest in adaptation and mitigation measures in Quebec. So we're investing in electrification of transportation. We just announced a $460 million investment in electrification of transportation. We invest also in public transit. We're investing in renewable energy. We're investing also in efficiency, new efficiency technologies, research. But the key component is that this money is invested in a transition of Quebec's economy into a clean tech economy, like we did in the 60s and 70s, where Quebec invested massively in hydroelectricity, and now we have the fourth largest hydroelectric utility in the world with Hydro-Quebec, like we did in the 80s and 90s when we invested massively in aeronautics, in the aeronautics industry, and now we have the third largest sector in the world. Now, with clean tech, for us, it's a positioning. So what we're doing is, through public investment, we're generating public-private partnerships and working with clean tech clusters, just like in the transportation industry, renewable energy industry, energy efficiency industries, to name a few, but also in healthcare and other fields to generate this economic development. And it's one of the reasons why we're here in France, because what we're also trying to do is spur also partnerships with other businesses and other governments in the world. But what's really interesting about this is that it's catching fire all around North America as well.
Well, there's a lot to talk about there, and it may not be surprised that David, like this week or last week, was awarded the first Carbon Pricing Champion Award. Who gave that out? Was that?
It was AIDA, actually.
AIDA, okay.
AIDA gave that out. We were very thrilled to be recognized in that way.
But I think the leadership is well deserved. So I want to get back to the partnerships. I want to get to the investment thesis. But before that, I want to bring Jonathan into this. So you've been hearing about what Stefan is doing. We heard a little bit about Jean-Pierre's call for carbon pricing. Yeah. We certainly have been talking a lot about carbon pricing, but the World Bank and IMF has been talking about it. Some of the world's major banks, a lot of companies have been calling for it. And yet, as Christiana said weeks or a couple months ago, that it's not going to be part of what's coming out of here necessarily. But how does the European Investment Bank think about this? What's your approach to thinking about carbon and pricing?
Well, we've been using carbon pricing and putting carbon pricing into our project assessments for some time now. Just in case anybody doesn't know, European Investment Bank is the public bank of the whole of the European Union. So we're doing about 70 to 80 billion new lending a year, of which we have a target that a minimum amount of that, 25% minimum of that should be for climate action. And as I say, we're using carbon pricing right across the piece. And I think the key point is that you need to try and make it as realistic as possible. The current market price in Europe is about €7 per tonne. We are using what we consider to be a realistic assessment, which ranges from 33 per tonne up to 120 per tonne, depending on the length of the project, the lifetime of the project, how far it is going forward. And we build all that into our economic assessment of a project when we decide to put money into that project, and it can be done.
And what does that change? How does that change how you look at the kinds of projects that you would do?
Well, it means, the obvious point is it means that you are looking more rigorously at the costs and benefits of the project. I mean, you could say that we have the luxury, or you could say that we have the additional constraint. That as a public bank, we are expected to assess the economic value of what we're doing, not merely a credit assessment, as it were.
But what I'm asking,
so taking that into account.
Are there things that you would have invested in before that you no longer will, or vice versa, things that you now would invest in because of that price factor?
Well, categorically, I wouldn't say that there are particular things which we would do and wouldn't do for that. We do, however, I should say, also have an emissions performance standard which we apply to our energy investments, and that emissions performance standard sort of overlays the carbon pricing judgment, which we're doing separately, and the emissions performance standard effectively screens out anything which with an emission of more than 550 G per kilowatt hour.
So how does this?
Which means coal.
Which means,
just to be clear.
Right.
And lignite and that sort of stuff. Just to be clear.
Just to be clear. So does, in some ways, it doesn't sound like it's a huge strategic realignment, or is it?
Well, it's not a huge strategic realignment because it's part of what we're doing, and we're doing it realistically, and we're doing it as part of the project. If you weren't doing it at all beforehand, if you weren't taking these sorts of costs and things costs into account, I dare say it would be a significant strategic realignment. But I mean, I would tend to look at it the other way around, which is that, you know, if it is some comfort, it's not that difficult to do if you do it properly. I think that's the point which I wanted to bring in to emphasize.
Good. Well, David, you're now in a position where you've got $1 billion. There's a favorite line from a former U.S. Senator, Everett Dirksen, who said you have $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking real money. And you're on your way to $3 billion in how long? In 2 or 3 years?
2020.
Oh, 2020. So
By 2020.
within 5 years. And you've heard some of what Stefan was talking about in terms of the kinds of at the venture capital stage. I'm wondering how you think about investments across the board, across the portfolio, from obviously big projects, infrastructure projects, to some of the earlier stage. How early stage are you going to go? How do you think? What are you allowed to do?
Well, obviously, what we're trying to do is adapt the investments to the constraints of, first of all, reducing emissions. That's the first target. Second target, you have to go and develop projects that will contribute to achieve those goals and also develop these new technologies. So for example, in Quebec, 45% of our emissions comes from the transportation sector. So obviously, the bulk of our work is going to be in the transportation sector. And what we're doing is developing projects with the private sector that will allow us to achieve substantial reductions. Now, for example, just give a real example. We invested $2 million in this Quebec company called E-Lion, which developed this entirely electric school bus. Now, a school bus, it may sound like trivial, but a school bus actually consumes 8,250 liters of diesel every year. That's 23 tons of CO2. So, and when we have 8,000 of them running in Quebec, so already, we've developed this, And not only have we created these jobs, but we developed this new technology. All the components were designed and developed and built in Quebec. And now the bus is running, is being tested in school boards across Quebec. And not only that, but now the company is looking to export the school bus around the world. So you have this example. We're doing the same thing thanks to the carbon market and the offset protocols, the offset credits. We've been able to have companies develop new technologies. So we have a company that developed a technology to recycle refrigerators. But again, that's a huge field. And all these companies have been able to, with the help of the Green Fund, find takers, develop the technology, and not only create jobs in Quebec, help us reduce our goals, but also export the technology.
Just to be clear, on the school bus, were they in the market with products and customers and revenue before you put money in, or were you?
They were, I would say, an old economy company.
Oh, that you converted.
And they were in the field of converting. And they wanted, they had this idea of developing this electric school bus. They came to us and we invested. We basically were the seed money. Mm-hmm. We were the venture capitalists, and we went ahead with them. And now the company is running and working.
So Stefan, how do you fit into all this? Because one of the, at least in Silicon Valley, one of the sort of maxims of venture capital is you stay away from things that have government funded or government, and that's been largely around subsidies and things like that. But how do you see, how does this affect the kinds of things that you're willing to invest in? Do the green funds, whether it's obviously in Canada but also in Europe, affect your investment decisions?
Well, we call ourselves an investment company and not a venture capital fund, and that's very deliberate. It's the way we're structured, actually. I think they overcompensated with the volume.
That's right. You're good.
These guys are freaking me out.
Yeah.
This is a different sector. If you look at the sectors venture capitalists in California or other places did well in, the internet and telecom and other such sectors, to a degree, maybe life sciences. But this is a capital-intensive industry. This is machines. This is infrastructure. And it's not natural to the venture capital sector at all. And they'll tell you as much. And, frankly, none of them have made money in the sector.
Tesla is about the only success story still.
Yeah, but you can't hang your hat on one company. You can't, these guys are all about comps. They're all about probabilities, right? They're mathematicians. They're, by the way, not operators. Most of the time, they don't know how to operate a business. They just know how to point the finger and say, you promised me revenue, there's no revenue, fire the staff, right?
So back to my question about
the question about governments is that because it's a capital-intensive sector, you have to look at public-private partnerships. So the private sector, I believe, needs to lead, but the public sector needs to set the guidelines in the regulatory framework, and in some cases, deploy money. But governments tend, with the exception of the example you gave, governments tend not to want to be caught picking winners and then picking losers, basically. Right. So a good example is Barack Obama getting in trouble from the Republicans because he picked on Solyndra, and then Solyndra went bankrupt, and then the Republicans said, this is what happens when big government gets involved. So I think that what we need is leadership from the private sector, be willing to take the risk, and then governments be supportive.
Jonathan, how is the EIB working with the private sector in some of these investments?
Well, we're doing a lot of public-private partnerships as part of what we do, and we're always co-investing with others, and many of those are private sectors. But on the specifically sort of public-private partnership technical sort of vehicle, we're doing quite a lot of that sort of stuff. We've been doing it in the renewables sector, but in particular we've been doing it more recently, and this is just the way it's panned out, in health sector, in the transport sector, and in other parts of the economy. But I mean, I think the key point, as always with these things, is that it's very easy you can say very simply what you need to make these things work. You can describe it very, very, very easily. What you need to have is you need a proper allocation of risks, and you need to make sure right up front that the pricing makes sense, and you need to make sure that the returns make sense, and all the rest of it. Crafting something which does that is actually pretty hard work. Yeah. But the experience which we have is that these things work well when you don't rush them in that way, and you make sure you've done all that. Because otherwise, if you rush them, you will find halfway through that the income stream doesn't come on, or you'll find that politics gets in the way because people will say that there's too much benefit going to the private investor, and so on and so forth. So you've got to take care.
Just one small point to add, and I think it's very important to note that we can't use government subsidies as a crutch. We tend to rely on them because it helps us get through quarter after quarter while we're expecting some kind of future growth event that maybe doesn't happen. We use government subsidies as a crutch, and it is not a healthy practice. An industry needs to take government subsidies as a spark to stimulate an industry for growth, as we did in Quebec with the multimedia industry. The government put money into the Cité du Multimédia in Montreal, but it learned how to swim on its own and stand on its own 2 feet, and became, if you watch any 3D or animated film from Hollywood these days, it's all Québécois names.
Yeah.
So that's what we need. We need projects and technologies that have the margins without the subsidy. And then we need to treat the subsidy like a cherry on a sundae. It's nice to have, but we're not going to live and die by it.
Well, they're going to give us the hook well before we're ready and run out of things to talk about. But I want to ask you what your plans are on Monday morning, December 14th. Literally the Monday morning after COP, in terms of how you see what's going to be coming out of COP, what you anticipate affecting what you do. Jonathan?
Well, I think what it's going to do is I hope that we're going to end up where we all think we're going to end up. And I think that is going to provide a lot more certainty in the way forward, which will help to encourage, and certainty of path is what people need if they want to invest. And you want to encourage investment. So I think it's going to be helping us to do that and helping us to attract that investment in.
What part, just to hone in on that a little bit, what part of it is going to help?
Well,
what's
I think
the specific mechanism?
at an earlier panel, picking up a point which someone was making at an earlier panel, you really do need some policy certainty around the policy framework if you're going to put your money into anything. Doesn't mean you need a subsidy, but it does mean you need to be pretty sure that the policy isn't going to change significantly during the lifetime of the investment, because otherwise the pricing on which you made the investment in the first place is going to go wrong, in which case you obviously aren't going to do it. So if we have some certainty at the end of next week that there is a clear, high-level, as concrete as possible commitment to that countries generally will be moving forward in this direction with their nationally determined contributions and all the rest of it, and the policy that goes with that, that will, I think, encourage investors considerably.
Yeah. David?
First point, I think it's important to stress out that the role in Quebec of the Green Fund is not necessarily to just subsidize. It's really to invest. It's to develop partnerships. We're really transforming the role of government as previously, okay, here's a subsidy, whatever. But now it's really more about return also. It's not just about putting money into the economy. It's really about building businesses and partnering with these businesses and actually transforming the paradigm from just a simple return on investment, but also not only a return, not only creating jobs, but also linking that performance to real emissions reductions.
So you developed not just financial returns, but social returns or carbon returns. Is that all baked into your investments?
Actually, the way the Green Fund works is that our deals with the different government agencies, because the Green Fund goes through the Ministry of Environment, then we have administrative agreements with different ministries and government agencies, and they must deliver returns to the government in turn, and those returns include emissions reductions. Mm-hmm. So it's not just about the creating jobs, not just about also return on investment in traditional sense, but return on investment is being redefined as being something that directly is linked to emissions reductions. And on top of that, what we're doing here is really transforming the economy, and there's a real momentum there. As you're seeing in North America post-COP, what we're doing, what's happened here is, first of all, I think there's a real consciousness about the role of subnational governments, of local governments, and the importance of their role in achieving any type of real change. And the second piece of it is that, so I think there's a consciousness that we'll be doing the heavy lifting. So provinces like Quebec, like Ontario, major cities will be doing the heavy lifting. And so we have a real role in reducing the emissions, of getting to that 2 degrees, but also there's an economic opportunity. And those that take advantage of this economic opportunity will be the true winners in the 21st century. So I think coming back home on the 14th, there'll be actually a lot of optimism and seeing that, okay, we're all together in this. And again, seeing Ontario joining us, Manitoba joining us, you're seeing BC and Alberta having a carbon tax or on the verge of adopting one. You're seeing Mexico wanting to join the Quebec-California market. You're seeing other US states seriously considering joining the Quebec-California model. So you're seeing an organic development, and this means that in turn, this will transform North America's economy and contribute to the world's change as well.
Great. Stefan, what are you going to do Monday morning?
I'm going to go to the gym, first of all, because, but no, I think,
personal sustainability comes first.
well, I need renewable energy in order to push renewable energy.
There you go.
I think we're going to continue to, of course, bullishly invest, but be, intelligent about the risks that we take. We're going to continue to advocate that whatever targets end up being agreed to, hopefully there will be some serious targets agreed to here, and enforceable targets with penalties or whatever mechanisms to enforce them, that they are achievable. This is the message that we want to send, that the technologies to bring down the cost of clean energy, for example, or innovate, on green transport and other areas, those technologies do exist. There isn't necessarily an R&D cycle of 15 years that we need to wait for, and that there are models out there to introduce those things into the marketplace and support them so that they can flourish. They will not all succeed, but enough of them will succeed that will start really making a dent in climate change.
Yeah, I think that's one of the important lessons here is that there's an incredible amount of optimism in the ability of technologies to take us much further, much faster than we have gone in carbon, and the role of finance. And we didn't really haven't had a chance to really get into what the public-private partnerships, how those really can be transformational. This is a topic we've been talking about forever, and we're still learning very much how the public sector works with technology companies in particular. There seem to be constantly, at least in different orbits. So that's another conversation for another day. But there's thank you all for the leadership that you are showing in your respective jurisdictions and respective sectors, because I think that is really showing the way to where we're all going. So please join me in thanking Stefan, David, and Jonathan.
Thank you. Great to meet you.
And to take the next part of the program that will take us to lunch, please welcome to the stage the Executive Chair of World Energy Trilemma at the World Energy Council, Joan McNaughton. Joan, there she is. Okay. Should go this way. Thank you.
Off by disagreeing with something from the earlier panel, which is that the role of public-private partnerships is a conversation for another day. It's actually a conversation.
Okay.
Going to have Rachel Kite from the World Bank to take us into that conversation, and Torben Moe Pedersen, and I would like to invite them to come up and join me on the stage as we engage on that issue and just how can PPPs be transformational. Now, we've heard some very interesting and different perspectives about whether the investment is there. I think the phrase was used that private sector investors were fleeing the scene, but we've also heard a lot of optimism, and we know that investment has grown enormously. But one of the things in the way of that happening more, as Jonathan Taylor from the EIB has just said, is that business leaders feel the need for confidence in the consistency of the policy frameworks. And in the World Energy Council, each year we do a survey of what keeps energy business leaders awake at night. And consistently in the top 3 of those issues is the lack of a global climate framework. So COP21 is going to sort that, isn't it? We hope. And that can be really very important indeed. We've done some work with investors and with energy business leaders and with policymakers about getting them to engage. And we do find that there is a lack of understanding. There's a lack of understanding on the part of policymakers about the impact that their announcements and policy changes can have on risk. There's a lack of understanding on the part of policymakers about the different kinds of investor, the different kinds of instruments that may be appropriate, and maybe investors there need to do a bit more to engage with the policy group. And we find that we need to understand better just what the real potential of some of these technologies is now rather than in theory or in future. And so these 3 groups probably are not talking with one another enough. And I think it's fantastic that the French presidency has had the business dialogue in the run-up to the COP. This is the kind of thing some of us have been arguing for many years. But I also think it's great that we're now going to have a conversation with someone representing a huge investor, Pension Denmark, Torben Mø Pedersen, and someone representing, if not a policymaker, a very, very strong policy influencer from the world of development finance, Rachel Kite. And Rachel's role has been a special envoy on climate change for the World Bank. So maybe, Rachel, and as you look to going on to an even more exciting new challenge, which is about solving that problem of access to energy, do you agree that private sector investors are fleeing? Do you agree that we can scale up, or can't we scale up at the kind of pace that we need to adopt now to deal with these challenges?
Well, we have, hello? Yeah, well, we have to scale up. So, and I think you can see the enormity of the opportunity, and we can see that parts of the market and parts of that opportunity are being realised actually very, very quickly. Things are moving very quickly, whether it's carbon pricing in North America, or whether it's off-grid solar in parts of Africa, or whether it's efficiency in parts of the world. Things are really moving very quickly, and then some things don't move very much at all. But I think the big difference between the conversations now and perhaps a few years ago is that I do think we're actually starting to talk to each other as opposed to talking past each other. But I think people are still being a little bit precious. So I think that there are business leaders, business associations who are just getting on with it and having the dialogue with government about what's really needed in order for the opportunity to be realised. And there are government leaders who are prepared to sit down and learn from the mistakes that other jurisdictions make, learn from the mistakes that they may have made in the past, and learn from the opportunities that they see other competing countries or competing regions or competing cities being able to realise. But there are still, and we've had sessions with OECD and the International Energy Agency and all the other sort of big acronyms in this space, and we've all been saying the same thing, which is the private sector's plea for certainty and predictability is absolutely correct. At the same time, you all know full well that you can't have copper-bottom certainty. The measure of a good business is a business that can constantly mine the future, look around the corners, and make good judgments. So why you need 100% certainty about what a green future looks like when you never had 100% certainty about what the brown future looked like? So let's park that. Right, that's just a waste of energy. Let's focus on the future. And then there's plenty of companies that need to and are trying to understand how to be competitive and create jobs in that low carbon economy are engaged in the conversation around pricing, are engaged in the conversation around performance measures by sector and all of the implicit as well as explicit rules that have to be put in place to allow them to succeed, who at the same time are funding candidates, are engaged in government policy and government affairs, which is undermining the ability of the political leaders to do what's difficult, which is to look around the corners and say we're going in this direction. So if anything, on the Monday after this COP, just let's have some boardroom coherence, some C-suite coherence, and hopefully we will have a text out of Le Bourget which gives us government coherence. If we have a little bit more of that, this thing can go even faster than it's already moving.
Well, fingers crossed then, but you're an institutional investor. One of these companies comes to you and says we're going to make, or you're aware that they are making a huge investment in an innovative area. Do you feel you can invest, given your responsibilities to the pensioners, who are your key fiduciary responsibility? I mean, what do you need to feel that you can invest more in the clean energy and infrastructure space?
Well, first of all, I agree with Rachel that things have been moving very fast. We made our first direct investment in renewable energy 5 years ago. We acquired a 50% stake in a Danish offshore wind farm. At that time, we were the only pension fund in Europe doing that kind of deals. Now, it is almost has become a plain vanilla asset class, at least for larger European institutional investors. And most of them are now, in some way or another, engaged in making investments in wind farms, solar facilities, transmission assets. This is not only because they are engaged in the climate agenda, but the very low bond yields makes it necessary for all long-term investors to identify alternative assets, new asset classes. And actually, when it's properly designed, climate-related infrastructure could be a very attractive asset class. They provide you with the possibility to deploy large investments because it's very capital-intensive projects. You can, if the, let's say, PPAs or feed-in tariff structures are well designed, you can look into a long period of relatively stable cash flow returns with a very low correlation to the overall business cycle. So actually, I think we have a very interesting window of opportunity where we can mobilize very large pools of private capital into climate-related projects because the investors need these alternatives because of the low government bond yields, and let's say the climate agenda needs private money as the public budgets all over the world are constrained. So, and as we are to discuss PPPs, I think that actually very many climate-related projects are by nature born as PPPs. The public sector has a very important role, as Rachel mentioned, to put up, let's say, a regulatory framework which makes investors feel comfortable, not giving any guarantees for the future, but reducing the political risk, the regulatory risk associated with these investments. So I think actually this model has been developed and are being used at a very large scale in North America and in Europe. What is needed now is to find ways to, let's say, mobilize the large private capital locked up in pension funds to make similar investments in emerging markets, where the need is even bigger than in our part of the world. 2 years ago, we tried to construct a vehicle making it possible for someone like us to overcome the risk associated with being an investor in emerging markets by establishing what we call the Danish Climate Investment Fund together with the Danish government. It's an example of what we call blended finance, where government provide a relatively small amount of the capital, but accept to have what you could call a first loss position, reducing the risk left over to the private investors who provide the majority of the capital into the structure. So in this way, government money get leverage by attracting private capital. We get some kind of comfort as the marginal risk are taken by the government. And I think we should develop these kind of blended finance models in order to increase the scale of investments in emerging markets on climate projects.
That's a great example, actually. And why do you think we are not moving forward more generally on that? I mean, what would need to happen for that example to be replicated quickly in many other countries?
Well, so I think actually things are moving, but of course we all want things to happen faster than the case at the moment. But we have a number of good examples out there, let's say role models of how to design investment vehicles in a way that give leverage to the public commitment and are giving private investors sufficient comfort. We're not talking about guarantees or subsidies, but so intelligent ways of combining public and private money. I think that's the way going forward. I think the Green Climate Fund is an example. It has been a long way on the way, but now they have decided I think their first 8 projects are now in execution. This is a global initiative, but also I think many European and American countries should find ways to combine the public aid budgets with the private pension industry's need for long-term investments.
And the development banks, Rachel, I mean, what are you already doing in that regard, and what more do you think could be done?
Well, I think we've been trying for a number of years, and Jonathan was just on the stage to find the ways to build financial packages which allow capital that has different risk appetites to come together to be able to fund a stream of investments. So we've got 20 odd years of using concessional finance to take first loss position, or to find other ways to de-risk projects, either because the technology risk is too high, or the currency or country risk, or whatever is too high, to try to show that the market is there and that investors can then follow into the market without any use of development finance or climate finance. So I think there's a long track record of that, but there's always been a problem with the pipeline of bankable projects. And I think that's been a problem for government, because governments, in order to have a pipeline of bankable projects, you actually need to have a sense of, well, which direction are we going in? What is the energy pathway that we're going to follow? And then for governments, a lot of this, you can plan for all of this, but the remarkable growth that we're seeing in off-grid solar at the moment, and the fact that business is being built bottom up by the mobile phone companies, not by big energy companies, show you that the levels of disruption are things that investors have to get comfortable with. We've also got asset management companies where we're using the IFC's origination capacity, whereby we can take investors such as sovereigns or institutional investors, and allow them to come inside alongside pari passu with us as we do the origination. You benefit from the experience of a multilateral development bank. So I think on both sides, the risk appetite of public finance is not always there for this blending with private finance. For all of the talk of public-private partnerships, the rules that parliaments and people put on their development finance and climate finance, and you see this in the GCF now, is so micromanaging and is so sort of technology non-neutral or very prescriptive about, well, we're only interested in solar. Well, okay, but if the country wants to use geothermal and hydro, and what are we really going to do? So I think that there has to be a sort of reset button on the way in which we use public finance in order to leverage private finance. And then the private finance risk appetite has to be absolutely clear, and where government bilaterally can come in and say, okay, we'll take some of that risk, then that can really help. And then finally, we have to mobilize the domestic resources. in the middle income countries, because that's actually where the big pool of funding is going to come from.
So some very interesting points there about the nature of risk and how you address it. And you said in specific terms that the way in which public finance is applied, and public development finance in particular, has to change, has to be reset. You know, I give you absolute power, Rachel, because I trust you. What would you do?
Well, first of all, we've got two conversations going on in Paris. A lot of the time, the conversation in the convention, in the finance discussions, is about how we're going to solve the ending of poverty and the reaching of a below 2 degrees world using 0.7% of the GDP of the OECD countries. Okay, that world no longer exists. That isn't how it's going to happen. It's going to happen by mobilizing the domestic resources of fast-growing economies or growing economies. It's going to be achieved by pricing that which we don't want, incentivizing that which we do, and then using public development finance and public climate finance to go do the things that other people won't do in the time frame we need them to do it, and to do the learning and to take the risk and to show that those markets are possible. Now, where we've really got a problem financially is that we need to massively invest in the resilience of our economies, the resilience of our infrastructure, and the resilience of our businesses and communities. And one of the, I'm going slightly off topic, but I mean, if you really want to think about the Monday after Paris as well, is are you all really sensitive to the adaptation risk that you're running in your businesses? Because that's going to be, that's the public money is going to go there first, because the aid mandates of parliaments where all this money comes from will be to protect the poorest. And so that money is going to get sucked up into adaptation and resilience. And so the adaptation risk that companies run and working around public-private participation on adaptation and resilience risk is going to be a big, big, big issue that we haven't spent enough time on in the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay, so we don't only have to cut emissions, we have to adapt and we have to build our resilience, which imports, you know, huge additional risk. In terms of the infrastructure and your investment in infrastructure, do you have a strategy in relation to the blend between mitigation, adaptation, resilience, Torben, or are you prepared to invest in any good project wherever it comes from? And picking up on one point that Rachel made about the need for, you know, a bigger pipeline of bankable projects, is that a constraint in your opinion?
Well, of course, we are looking into many different investment activities. Some of them are not directly linked to climate issues, but we have a strategic decision saying that approximately 10% of our assets are to be invested directly in renewable energy infrastructure assets like wind farms, solar facilities. We have 700,000 members of our pension plan. We are now the owner of clean energy production facilities of approximately 2,000 megawatts, meaning that we can actually provide all the members of our pension plan not only with good pension, but also with clean energy. This is a very strong telling point in our dialogue and communication with the members, and they feel, they really appreciate that they can see that their savings are invested in a meaningful way. So I think there are very big, let's say, possibilities for pension funds to actually enter into a dialogue with their members, with their stakeholders, in order to create a strong backing for a sustainable approach to investment. On the adaptation side, we have decided that all our investments in real estate, when we are making new office buildings and things like that, are to be built in a way where they can achieve a sustainability certification. In US, it's called LEED. In Germany, it's called BREEAM. In Scandinavia, it's called DGNB. It's in foreign practice, it's the same thing. But by investing in sustainable real estate, we are supporting the climate agenda, but we're also actually making good business, as these type of real estate can attract high quality leases, those who want to use our office building will pay a premium because they can see the effect of combining low rent and high rent but low energy cost. So I think there are a number of ways where investors can, at the same time, do good business and support the climate agenda, both on the adaptation and the mitigation issue. So I think the most important thing is that we have to use more time and resources to develop models for combining public and private funds. And now we heard from the European Investment Bank before, actually the so-called the Juncker Fund, the European Fund for Strategic Investment, EFSI, which is managed by Jonathan and his colleagues, is actually the first example from the European Union where to allocate public money into partnerships with private money. We have made our first cooperation. The EFSI has committed almost 100 million euro to some of our infrastructure projects as an example of how to combine private and public money in Europe, but the same can be done also targeting emerging markets, where I totally agree with Rachel that you also have to think in the mobilization of local funds in this area.
We're being asked to allow everybody to go and have their very well-deserved lunch break. Before we do, I'd like to invite you to make one closing remark, and I hope it might include something around what you'd really like to see coming out of the agreement. I mean, of course, there are lots of things on the menu that we want, but, you know, what's the one thing that might be at risk of not being given enough importance? Or any other point that you'd like to round off with. So, Rachel, what's your wish list?
Well, I think there's one thing that I think is going to really pick up speed, irrespective of what gets said in the convention, and that is the whole question of financial risk and the way in which the financial regulators think about risk and the way they think about how the financial sector should behave and how businesses should behave. And I think that if that happens, that will give you another underpinning for some of the long-range risk decisions that you have to make, which are so complex. And that's the work that came out of the UNEP inquiry, and now Mark Carney's working group with the Chinese and the G20 financial risk work, etc. So I think keep an eye on that. So what do I want out of I would like us to agree that we want to be below 2. I would like us to recognise that markets are going to play a very important role in this. I don't expect, I think I called it, the carbon pricing Dumbledore to come and sort of just appear in the language and say there will be a global carbon price and it will be X. That's fantasy, it's not happening, but just a recognition of markets. And then I would like the text to be channel neutral in terms of the channeling of climate finance, because we've got financing for mitigation, we need much more financing for adaptation, and eventually we're going to have to pay for loss and damage. And so we just need to have language which enables the smartest mechanisms possible to be established and not to be over-prescribing.
Thank you. Torben.
Well, I hope that we will get a good agreement here in Paris, and especially I hope that this will inspire governments all over the world to make responsible plans for their own climate mitigation and adaptation processes. And if they do that and do that in a reliable way, they will be able to attract a very large pool of private capital. So I think there's a very important connection between the political commitment and the willingness from private investors to step in.
So we're back to where we normally are when we're seeking to make big changes, which is follow the money. I mean, really, we have to get this financing to flow at a multiple of the trend rate of financing that we've seen, although it's been increasing very fast over recent years and, double the investment in renewables compared to 2000. We really need to double again and quadruple for energy access. So that's the challenge. I hope that we do get the kind of agreement which is a facilitation of that finance flowing, and then which allows people to work in a pragmatic way, a flexible way to adapt to what needs to be done in the future. And we don't constrain them, as both Rachel and Torben have been saying, in ways that prevent the innovation we need, both at the policy level, at the financial level, and in business itself. I'm sure you'd like to join me in thanking Rachel and Torben for their contributions. Thank you. Great, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, just a quick note on organization. We have now a lunch break until 14:00, all the way back there. And we will start sharp again at 14:00 with 3 parallel sessions. The plenary 3, the winter sports industry, and building a sustainable bioeconomy. Thank you very much.